His hands were always cold when they closed my bedroom door. The sound of that latch clicking shut still echoes in my nightmares. 47 years later, a metallic whisper that promised hours of terror stretched out like an eternity. The floorboards would creak under his weight as he approached each footfall, a countdown to horror. In the suffocating darkness of that small room, with only the faint moonlight filtering through moth-eaten curtains, I learned that evil doesn't announce itself with fire and brimstone. Sometimes it wears the face of family, carries a worn Bible, and speaks in verses while destroying souls. That's how I discovered the devil doesn't need flames to burn. He just needs opportunity silence and a child too frightened to scream. I am Betty Johnson, and I am 83 years old. For most of my life, I have carried this story like a stone in my chest, feeling it grow heavier with each passing year, each sleepless night, each moment when a memory would surface unbidden and steal my breath away. The weight of silence nearly crushed me more than once. But today, sitting in my modest home in Millbrook, Virginia, surrounded by the rolling Blue Ridge Mountains that have kept so many secrets over the centuries, I find the courage to speak. The mountains outside my window rise like ancient guardians, their peaks shrouded in morning mist that catches the light and transforms it into something ethereal. These same mountains watched over my childhood, silent witnesses to horrors that should never have been allowed to unfold in their shadow. Today they seem to nod in approval as I finally give voice to what they have known all along. This is a story of survival of faith, tested in the crucible of unimaginable cruelty, and of how sometimes, just sometimes, divine intervention arrives in the most unexpected forms. It is a story of a girl who was broken but refused to stay shattered, who found light in the deepest darkness, and who learned that healing is not a destination, but a journey that continues long after the wounds have scarred over. I was born in 1940, when the world was already burning with war. Though in our small corner of rural Virginia, the conflict felt as distant as the moon. Our house stood at the end of a dirt road that turned to thick, sucking mud whenever the rains came, which they did often in the spring, drumming against our tin roof like impatient fingers. The structure itself was humble rough-hewn wooden boards that had weathered to the color of old bones, a porch that sagged slightly on one side, where the foundation had settled unevenly, and windows that rattled in their frames when the mountain winds picked up. In those early years, we had dirt floors that my mother swept religiously each morning, the broom sending tiny dust clouds dancing in the shafts of sunlight that managed to squeeze through our small windows. Later, when I was about 6, my father and several neighbors worked together to lay a concrete floor, mixing the cement by hand in a wheelbarrow that had seen better days. I remember watching them work, fascinated by how the gray liquid transformed into something solid and permanent. I had no way of knowing then that this same floor would become a source of torment, its cold hardness biting into my knees during countless hours of forced penance. My father, George, was a man carved from the same hard wood as the mountains themselves, weathered, enduring, shaped by years of physical labor that began before dawn and ended well after sunset. His hands were permanently stained with soil, his back perpetually bent from years of tending other people's fields. He would leave our house while the stars were still bright overhead, carrying a lunch pail that my mother had packed with whatever we could spare, usually cornbread and perhaps a piece of salt pork if we were fortunate. He wouldn't return until the sun had already disappeared behind the mountain peaks, leaving only a crimson glow that painted the sky like spilled blood. My mother, Sarah, found work at the Wilson estate, that sprawling plantation house that dominated our valley like a white columned monument to wealth and privilege. The Wilsons owned nearly everything worth owning in those parts: the general store, the lumber mill, most of the fertile farmland that rolled out from the base of the mountains like a green carpet. My mother would rise even earlier than my father, before the roosters had begun their morning announcements, to walk the 3 miles to the big house where she would spend her days, bent over washboards, her hands raw and bleeding from the harsh lye soap she used to scrub the stains from fine linens and delicate garments that cost more than our family would see in a year. I can still picture her trudging up and down those red clay hills that became treacherous slopes of slippery mud during the rainy season, her arms wrapped around bundles of laundry that seemed to grow heavier with each step. The clay would stick to her shoes in thick clumps, adding pounds to each footfall, and by the time she reached home, her worn boots would be caked with the stuff. She would scrape it off with a stick before entering the house, but the red dust had a way of finding its way into everything. Our clothes, our food, even our dreams seemed tinged with that distinctive rust color. Despite our poverty, there was dignity in our simple life. We had little, but what we had was earned through honest labor and maintained with fierce pride. My mother's cornbread was legendary in our community, golden and perfectly textured, despite being made in our ancient cast-iron oven that required precise knowledge of its temperamental moods. My father could fix anything that broke, and in a community where broken things were mended rather than replaced, this made him invaluable to his neighbors. Our evenings were spent gathered around our small wooden table, lit by a single kerosene lamp that cast dancing shadows on the walls. My father would tell stories of his day in the fields, describing the progress of crops, the behavior of farm animals, the small dramas that unfolded in the agricultural community. My mother would mend clothes by lamplight, her needle moving in steady, hypnotic rhythms, while she hummed hymns under her breath. These were precious hours filled with the quiet contentment that comes from family unity and shared purpose. I was 7 years old when everything changed, when the serpent entered our modest Eden in the form of a man carrying a Bible. My grandfather, Jerome, arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, stepping down from Mr. Henderson's wagon with his few possessions tied up in a bundle of faded cloth. He was my father's father, a widower, whose wife, my grandmother Clara, had died of a heart attack the previous spring. I had never met him before, as he lived nearly 50 miles away in a cabin deeper in the mountains, and travel in those days was difficult and expensive. He was a tall, angular man with silver hair that he kept precisely combed and eyes the color of winter ice. His face was deeply lined, carved by years of mountain weather, and what I would later learn was an inner hardness that had calcified over decades. He carried himself with the rigid posture of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. And wherever he went, that worn black Bible was never far from his hand. It's a blessing to have Mr. Jerome here," my mother said as she prepared the small back room that had previously served as our tool shed. She swept it thoroughly, laid down fresh straw for bedding, and hung a curtain across the doorway for privacy. "He can watch Betty while we're gone, and he helps with the expenses." At first, it truly did seem like a blessing sent from heaven itself. Grandfather Jerome had a gift for storytelling that transformed our humble kitchen into a theater of biblical wonders. He would open that black Bible, its pages so worn that some were held together with careful stitches of thread, and transport me to ancient worlds filled with miracles and adventures. David, facing down the giant Goliath, with nothing but a sling and unshakable faith. Noah building his ark while his neighbors mocked, only to watch the floodwaters rise around them. Moses standing before Pharaoh demanding freedom for his people, with the authority of the Almighty behind his words. When he spoke of Jesus, his entire demeanor would change. His pale eyes would kindle with an inner fire that I mistook for true devotion, and his voice would drop to a reverent whisper that made every word seem sacred. He described the miracles water turned to wine, the blind receiving sight, the dead raised to life with such vivid detail that I could almost see them unfolding before my eyes. "Faith, little Betty," he would say, placing a surprisingly gentle hand on my head. "Faith is the most powerful force in the universe. With true faith, mountains can be moved, seas can be parted, and even the humblest servant of God can work wonders. Those early months established a routine that seemed perfectly normal, even beneficial. I would leave for school each morning with my patched but clean uniform and my small notebook tucked under my arm, walking the 1.5 miles to the one-room schoolhouse where Miss Patterson taught all grades from 1st through 8th. I loved school with a passion that surprised my parents. Loved the feel of chalk in my fingers as I worked problems on the blackboard. Loved the musty smell of old books. Loved the way knowledge felt as it settled into my mind, like seeds finding fertile soil. I would return home around 11 o'clock to find Grandfather Jerome waiting with lunch, prepared usually beans and rice, sometimes with a piece of sausage or dried meat if we had been fortunate at the market. He would ask about my lessons, showing genuine interest in what I had learned occasionally, even helping me with particularly difficult arithmetic problems, or challenging me to recite the poems Miss Patterson had taught us. It was during these afternoon hours that the first subtle changes began to manifest, changes so gradual that they felt like the natural progression of seasons rather than the calculated campaign of a predator. His gaze began to linger on me in ways that made my skin prickle with unease. When I would bend over my schoolwork, I could feel his eyes following the line of my neck, the curve of my shoulder, the way my dress fell across my legs. If I caught him staring, he would immediately look away and launch into a lecture about the importance of modesty, as if I had somehow invited his inappropriate attention. A young lady must be mindful of how she presents herself, he would say, his voice taking on an edge of reproach. The way you sit, the way you move, even the way you breathe, everything must be done with awareness of how it might affect the men around you. I was 12 years old and had no idea what he meant, but the weight of his words settled on my shoulders like a heavy cloak that grew more oppressive with each passing day. The transformation from ordinary childhood to living nightmare accelerated dramatically when my father fell gravely ill with pneumonia during the harsh winter of 1952. The sickness seized him like a vice, leaving him bedridden for weeks, while a racking cough shook his entire frame and fever burned through his body like a consuming fire. Money, always tight in our household, became virtually non-existent. My mother was forced to double her hours at the Wilson estate, leaving before dawn and not returning until well after dark, her hands so raw from the additional washing that they cracked and bled, despite the homemade salve she applied each night. The solution to my care seemed obvious and practical. I would leave school and remain home full-time, helping with household chores, while Grandfather Jerome supervised my education and moral development. You'll stay with your grandfather. My mother decided, running her work-roughened fingers through my hair with a tenderness that I wouldn't fully appreciate until years later. He'll teach you about God and proper behavior. That's more valuable than anything you'll learn in that schoolhouse. And so began my true ordeal, though it would be years before I could name it as such. With my parents gone from 6 in the morning until well past 2 in the afternoon, I was left entirely alone with Grandfather Jerome and the increasingly rigid structure of religious instruction that he claimed was necessary for my spiritual development. What had begun as gentle Bible stories evolved into hours of intense catechism lessons with me, seated at our kitchen table, copying endless passages of Scripture, while he watched every movement of my hand, every formation of each letter. Your penmanship reflects the condition of your soul, he would intone, standing behind my chair so close that I could feel his breath on the back of my neck. Sloppy writing indicates a sloppy spirit. Crooked letters suggest a crooked heart. God notices every detail, Betty, every single detail. If I made an error in transcription, if my handwriting wasn't perfectly uniform, if I dared to shift in my chair from fatigue or discomfort, punishment was immediate and certain. The correction always began the same way, with those 4 words that would haunt my dreams for decades to come. On your knees, Betty. He would point to the concrete floor, that same gray surface my father had worked so hard to install, now transformed into an instrument of torment. That's how you properly approach God when you've committed a sin. Humility and submission. These are the virtues that please the Almighty. Initially, the punishments seemed almost reasonable by the harsh standards of rural discipline in the 1950s. 15 minutes of kneeling while reciting the Lord's Prayer and Hail Mary seemed manageable, even appropriate for a child who had made mistakes in her lessons. But like everything else about Grandfather Jerome's methods, the punishments followed a pattern of steady escalation that was so gradual, I barely noticed until I was already trapped in a web of increasing cruelty. 15 minutes became 30, then an hour, then entire afternoons spent on that unforgiving concrete, until my knees were scraped raw and my legs trembled from the strain. The simple prayers expanded to include lengthy confessions of sins I couldn't even name, much less understand. And always, there was the underlying message that my very existence as a girl was somehow fundamentally wrong, inherently sinful, in constant need of correction and control. Tears are a sign of weakness. He would lecture as I knelt before him, my knees burning with pain and my eyes streaming with moisture I couldn't control. There an invitation for Satan to enter your heart. A truly repentant soul accepts correction with gratitude, not with the self-pity that leads to weeping. The physical torment was refined and intensified with each passing week. He forced me to kneel with my arms outstretched in imitation of Christ's crucifixion, timing me with his pocket watch, and restarting the punishment entirely if my arms dropped even an inch. My shoulders would scream with agony, my muscles trembling with exhaustion, but showing any sign of weakness only prolonged the ordeal. "It's for your own good," he would say, settling into the rocking chair that had been my grandmother's, his pale eyes never leaving my suffering form. "It's to cleanse your soul of the corruption that lives in every daughter of Eve. You carry the seeds of destruction within you, child. Only through suffering can those seeds be prevented from taking root." What sins could a 12-year-old girl possibly commit that would warrant such treatment? The question would torment me for years, but Grandfather Jerome seemed to have an inexhaustible catalog of transgressions that he could identify in my every action, every expression, every breath. Existing was sin enough, it seemed. Being born female was the original crime from which all others flowed. When my body began to change at 13, developing the first subtle curves that marked the transition from childhood to adolescence, the sins that Grandfather Jerome perceived in me multiplied exponentially. One afternoon, he discovered me combing my hair in front of the small, cracked mirror that hung in our living room, a perfectly innocent act of basic grooming that he transformed into evidence of moral corruption. "Vanity," he roared, yanking the comb from my hand with such violence that several strands of my hair came away with it, roots and all. The sudden pain brought tears to my eyes, which only fueled his rage further. "Do you know what the Bible says about vain women? They are like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but full of rotting corruption within." That afternoon introduced a new refinement to my punishments that was so exquisitely painful it took my breath away. Instead of kneeling on the smooth concrete, I was forced down onto scattered kernels of dried corn, their sharp edges digging into the tender skin of my knees like dozens of tiny knives. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but crying out or attempting to shift my weight only extended the duration of the torture. As I knelt there biting my lip until it bled to keep from screaming, he read passage after passage about Eve's fall from grace, about how women had brought sin into the world through their weakness and temptation. His voice droned on and on, a hypnotic litany of condemnation that seemed to burrow into my brain and take up permanent residence there. "Repeat after me," he commanded, his voice taking on that peculiar intensity that I was beginning to associate with his most dangerous moods. "I am the cause of sin. I am the cause of sin." I whispered the words, feeling like poison on my tongue. "I am temptation made flesh. I am temptation made flesh. My body is an instrument of the devil. My body is an instrument of the devil." Each forced confession felt like swallowing pieces of glass, cutting me from the inside as they worked their way through my system. But refusing to repeat his words would only make everything worse, much, much worse. I had learned that resistance was not only futile, but counterproductive, serving only to inflame his righteous fury and extend my suffering indefinitely. After that day, the purification rituals became as regular as meals, as predictable as sunrise woven into the fabric of my daily existence, until I could barely remember what life had been like before. He claimed to see demons in my reflection, evil spirits that had taken up residence in my developing body and needed to be driven out through prayer, fasting, and physical mortification. When my breasts began to show beneath my blouses, he forced me to wrap them tightly with strips of cloth torn from old sheets, binding them so securely that breathing became difficult, and the fabric left angry red welts on my skin that lasted for days. Instruments of perdition, he would mutter as he watched me struggle with the bindings, his eyes fixed with uncomfortable intensity on exactly the areas he claimed were sources of sin. Tools that Satan uses to lead righteous men astray. The contradiction between his professed horror at my developing body and his obvious fascination with it was lost on me at the time. I was too young, too isolated, too thoroughly indoctrinated in his twisted theology to recognize the signs of a predator who was using religious authority to satisfy his own dark urges. When I experienced my first menstrual period at 14, I was terrified and confused, having received no preparation for this natural biological process. I ran to my mother in panic, and she explained the basics with her characteristic practicality, providing me with strips of cloth and instructions for managing this new aspect of womanhood. But somehow, whether through overheard conversation or observation of the evidence, Grandfather Jerome discovered what had happened. That night, while my exhausted parents slept the deep sleep of those who labor from dawn to dusk, he crept into the small room I shared with my younger siblings and roused me with a grip on my arm that left purple bruises for days afterward. "Come with me," he whispered, his voice carrying a new quality that made my stomach clench with dread. "We need to cleanse this sin from you immediately." He dragged me to the kitchen where he had already prepared his materials for what I would later understand was a particularly sophisticated form of psychological torture. A single candle flickered on the table, casting wild shadows that danced across the walls like demons celebrating. His black Bible lay open to Leviticus, to those ancient passages about the supposed impurity of menstruating women. "On your knees!" he commanded, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that had become the soundtrack to my nightmares. I obeyed, immediately sinking down onto the cold concrete that seemed to leach the warmth from my body through my thin nightgown. "You now carry the mark of Eve," he intoned, beginning to pace around me in slow, measured circles. The candle flame threw his shadow onto the wall in grotesque proportions, transforming him into a giant predator stalking his prey. "Your body has become a source of corruption, a walking temptation, a devil's trap designed to ensnare good men and drag them down to hell." The ritual that followed was the most psychologically damaging experience of my young life up to that point. For hours I was forced to repeat increasingly degrading statements about my own nature, to confess to crimes I had never contemplated, to accept responsibility for the lustful thoughts of any man who might look upon me. The cold floor bit into my knees until they bled, but the physical pain paled in comparison to the systematic destruction of my self-worth that was taking place with each forced word. "Louder," he would demand when my voice faltered with exhaustion and despair. "God needs to hear your repentance. The demons that have taken residence in your polluted flesh need to understand that they are not welcome." But the worst part, the aspect of these midnight rituals that would haunt me long after the physical scars had faded, was when he would place his hands on my head and begin to pray in tongues, speaking in a strange guttural language that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his throat. His fingers would grip my skull with painful intensity, his entire body trembling with what I believed was religious ecstasy, but which I now understand was something far more sinister. Ask forgiveness. He would command his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. Not from God, from me. Ask forgiveness for tempting me with your body of perdition. Beg me to pardon you for the impure thoughts you force me to have. Please forgive me. I would whisper, tears streaming down my face and mixing with the blood from my wounded knees. Forgive me for tempting you. Forgive me for making you have bad thoughts. It's my fault. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. This became the pattern for every perceived transgression, every imagined sin, every sign of normal adolescent development. If I smiled at a neighbor boy, if I hummed a song that wasn't explicitly religious, if I took too long bathing, or seemed to enjoy my food too much, any excuse would serve to trigger another purification ritual. My parents, exhausted by their constant struggle to keep our family fed and housed, failed to notice the obvious signs of abuse, the perpetual bruises on my knees and arms, the way I flinched when any man approached, how I had stopped smiling entirely and seemed to shrink into myself whenever Grandfather Jerome entered a room. Or perhaps they noticed, but chose not to see, finding it easier to believe that their strict religious father-in-law was simply providing the moral guidance that they were too busy to deliver themselves. The truth was too terrible to acknowledge, too threatening to the fragile stability of our family structure to confront directly. By the time I turned 15, the nightly terrors had begun. I would dream of demons chasing me through endless corridors of hellfire, opening beneath my feet, of standing before the throne of God, only to be rejected and cast into eternal damnation. I would wake screaming, my nightgown soaked with sweat, my heart pounding so hard it seemed likely to burst from my chest. And always, I would find Grandfather Jerome standing in the doorway of my room, watching me with those pale, cold eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. "You see," he would say with satisfaction, "it's your guilty conscience, your body full of sin, crying out for purification. Even in sleep, the demons torment you with visions of your own corruption." These dream interpretations would trigger yet another midnight ritual, another journey to the kitchen for hours of kneeling and forced confession, another systematic assault on whatever remained of my sense of self-worth and personal agency. It was during this period that I began to question not just my own worth, but the very existence of the God who supposedly demanded such suffering from his children. What kind of loving deity would allow a child to endure such torment? What kind of merciful father would remain silent while one of his servants used divine authority to terrorize and abuse an innocent girl? What kind of just judge would condemn someone for crimes they had never committed, for sins that existed only in the twisted imagination of a predator wearing the mask of holiness? These doubts were perhaps the most dangerous thoughts I could have entertained, because questioning God's justice or existence was, according to Grandfather Jerome's theology, the ultimate sin, worse than murder, worse than adultery, worse than any crime of the flesh. Doubt was shaking hands with Satan himself, opening the door of my soul to every form of evil and corruption. So I learned to hide these questions deep within my heart, to pretend faith I no longer felt, to mouth prayers that had become meaningless sounds, to perform repentance for sins I knew I hadn't committed. It was the only way to survive in a world where authenticity was punished and submission was the only currency that could purchase even brief respites from torment. I became an actress playing the role of the repentant sinner with such skill that even I sometimes forgot where the performance ended and reality began. I developed the ability to split my consciousness to observe my own suffering from a distance, as if it were happening to someone else entirely. This dissociation was perhaps the only thing that preserved whatever remained of my essential self during those dark years. But even the most skilled performance has its limits, and as I approached my 16th birthday, I could sense that Grandfather Jerome's twisted rituals were building toward some terrible crescendo. There was a new quality in his gaze when he looked at me, a hunger that went beyond spiritual domination and entered territory that my young mind couldn't fully comprehend, but my instincts recognized as mortally dangerous. The change in his behavior was subtle but unmistakable. His hands would linger longer when he placed them on my head during prayer sessions. His breathing would become heavier during the forced confessions. He began to find excuses to touch me, adjusting my posture during kneeling, checking to ensure my modest clothing was properly arranged, placing his hands on my shoulders when delivering particularly intense lectures about the corruption of feminine flesh. One evening in early summer, just 3 weeks before my 16th birthday, I was helping my mother prepare dinner when she noticed me favoring my left leg, trying to keep weight off a knee that had been particularly brutalized during the previous night's purification ritual. "What's wrong with your leg, child?" she asked, looking up from the potatoes she was peeling. Before I could answer, Grandfather Jerome's voice cut across the kitchen like a knife. "Betty has been clumsy lately, stumbling during her prayers. It's a sign of spiritual instability of the demons trying to disrupt her communion with the Almighty." My mother accepted this explanation without question, as she had learned to accept all of his pronouncements about my spiritual condition. But I caught something in her eyes, a flicker of doubt perhaps, or maybe just motherly concern that she was afraid to express openly. For just a moment, I allowed myself to hope that she might ask more questions, might demand to see the wounds on my knees, might finally recognize what had been happening under her own roof. But the moment passed, and the hope died with it. She returned to her potato peeling, and Grandfather Jerome smiled with the satisfaction of a predator who has successfully deceived his prey's protectors. That night, he woke me earlier than usual, shaking me from deep sleep with hands that trembled with barely controlled excitement. The summer heat had turned our small house into an oven during the day, but the mountain nights still carried a chill that bit through my thin cotton nightgown and set me shivering before we even left my room. "Tonight is special," he whispered as he dragged me toward the kitchen, his grip on my arm painful enough to leave fresh bruises. "Tonight you'll learn what happens to daughters of Eve who refuse to fully embrace their need for purification." I had grown to dread these midnight sessions, but something about his demeanor that night filled me with a terror that went beyond my usual fear. There was an anticipation in his movements, an eagerness in his voice that suggested this would not be like the previous rituals. This would be something new, something worse, something that would cross whatever invisible lines had previously contained his cruelty within merely psychological bounds. The kitchen was prepared as always, with the single candle casting its hellish light across the rough wooden table where his black Bible lay open to some condemnatory passage. But tonight, he had added new elements to his altar of torment, a pair of heavy scissors that glinted malevolently in the flickering light, and several strips of rope that he had arranged with the careful precision of a craftsman preparing his tools. "On your knees," he commanded, pointing to the exact spot where my blood had stained the concrete from countless previous sessions. I obeyed, sinking down onto the familiar cold hardness, my body already beginning to tremble with anticipation of whatever new horror he had devised. The candle flame danced in a draught I couldn't feel, casting our shadows on the walls in grotesque pantomime of the real drama unfolding. "Do you know why we're here tonight?" he asked, beginning his usual circling pattern around my kneeling form. "Because I saw you today. I saw the way you looked at that Henderson boy when he drove past with the hay wagon. I saw the smile, the batting of eyelashes, the deliberate display of your budding womanhood, designed to ensnare his innocent soul. Tommy Henderson was 18 years old, the youngest son of our neighbor. And yes, we had exchanged a perfectly innocent smile when he passed our house that afternoon. In any normal world, such a brief, friendly interaction would have been meaningless. But in the twisted universe that Grandfather Jerome had created around me, it was evidence of my fundamental corruption, proof of my role as Satan's agent in the corruption of righteous men. "I didn't do anything wrong!" I whispered, the words escaping before I could stop them. The slap that followed was so violent, it knocked me sideways, my head ringing, and my vision filled with bursting stars. I tasted blood where my teeth had cut the inside of my cheek, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if the metallic flavor was from the injury or from the fear that had taken up permanent residence in my mouth. "Ah, are you calling me a liar?" He roared, his face contorting with a rage that seemed to transform his features into something barely human. "Are you saying that a man of God, a servant of the Most High, is mistaken about what he witnessed with his own eyes?" No, I gasped, pressing my hand to my burning cheek. "I'm sorry. You're right, I sinned. I tempted him. It's my fault." The words came out in a panicked rush, anything to forestall another blow, another explosion of his terrifying wrath. I had learned that admitting guilt, even for imaginary crimes, was often the fastest way to end these confrontations before they escalated to even worse extremes. "Good," he said, his voice dropping back to that dangerous whisper that was somehow more frightening than his shouting. "Now we're going to address the source of your sinful behavior. Tonight, we're going to remove the instruments of your vanity." He picked up the heavy scissors, their blades catching the candlelight like the weapons they had become. My eyes widened with horror as I understood his intention, and I began to shake my head frantically, knowing even as I did so that protest would only make everything worse. "Please," I begged, my voice breaking. "Please, not my hair. It's all I have. It's the only thing that's mine." My hair was indeed the only thing I took any pride in, the sole aspect of my appearance that I was allowed to maintain without constant criticism and correction. It was long and thick and black as mountain coal, reaching almost to my waist when I let it down from the tight braids my mother wove each morning. She always said it was just like my paternal grandmother's hair had been when she was young, the grandmother I had never met, but who lived on in the genetic inheritance of my appearance. It was my only connection to this mysterious woman who had died before I was born, my only link to a family history that extended beyond the narrow, terrifying world that Grandfather Jerome had constructed around me. Losing it would be like losing the last vestige of my identity, the final proof that I had once been someone other than the corrupt, sinful creature he claimed I was. "Your hair is your vanity, your snare, your instrument of seduction," he said, moving behind me with the scissors held ready. "We're going to end that tonight. On your knees and thank God for this act of purification." I knelt there on the cold concrete, my entire body shaking with terror and grief, feeling the hot tears streaming down my face as he positioned himself behind me. The first cut was like a scream in the silent night, a harsh metallic sound that seemed to echo off the kitchen walls like gunshots. He worked with methodical brutality, hacking away sections of my hair with no concern for evenness or artistry. Some areas he cut almost to the scalp, leaving rough stubble that scraped against his scissors. Other sections he left in uneven chunks that stuck out at grotesque angles. It wasn't just vandalism, it was a systematic destruction of every aspect of my appearance that might be considered attractive or feminine. "Repeat after me," he commanded, between cuts, his breathing heavy with exertion and excitement. "I thank God for freeing me from the sin of vanity. I thank God for freeing me from the sin of vanity." I whispered each word, feeling like swallowing broken glass. "I thank God for making me ugly so that I cannot tempt righteous men. I thank God for making me ugly so that I cannot tempt righteous men." When he finished, he held up the cracked mirror, that hung on our kitchen wall, forcing me to look at the destruction he had wrought. The image that stared back at me was almost unrecognizable, a hollow-eyed, tear-stained face surrounded by the ragged remains of what had once been my crowning glory. I looked like a victim of some terrible accident, or like someone who had been attacked by a wild animal. "Look at yourself now," he said with evident satisfaction. "Less tempting, isn't it? Less dangerous to the souls of good men." But even this humiliation wasn't enough to satisfy whatever dark hunger was driving him that night. He set the mirror aside and knelt in front of me, his pale eyes now holding that new quality I had been dreading, a heat that had nothing to do with religious fervor and everything to do with the most fundamental human evil. "Now comes the most important part," he whispered, his voice taking on an intimate quality that made my skin crawl. "The true purification that will cleanse your body of the corruption that infects every daughter of Eve." His hands reached toward the neckline of my nightgown, and I knew with perfect, terrifying clarity that all the previous horrors had been merely preparation for this moment. Everything he had done, the forced prayers, the brutal punishments, the systematic destruction of my self-worth, had been building toward this ultimate violation. He had been grooming me, preparing me, breaking down my resistance, so that when this moment came, I would be too defeated, too convinced of my own sinfulness to resist effectively. But something deep within me, some spark of the person I had been before his campaign of psychological destruction, began suddenly flared to life. As his fingers fumbled with the buttons of my nightgown, I felt a surge of desperate energy that I hadn't experienced in years. "No," I screamed the word, exploding from my throat with such force that it surprised both of us. "No, I won't let you. I'm not evil. I'm not corrupt. I'm just a girl." I tried to scramble backward to escape his reaching hands, but my knees were too damaged from hours of kneeling to support my weight properly. I fell sideways, my hip striking the concrete hard enough to send shooting pains up my spine, but I kept trying to crawl away from him toward the door, toward escape, toward anything that might save me from what I knew was about to happen. He lunged after me, his face twisted with rage at my unexpected resistance. "You dare defy me!" he snarled, grabbing my ankle and dragging me back toward him despite my desperate attempts to claw at the smooth concrete floor. "You dare reject the purification that God Himself has commanded." God doesn't want this," I screamed, kicking at his hands with my free foot. "This isn't God. This is you. This is your sin, not mine." The words seemed to enrage him beyond all reason. He released my ankle and raised his hand to strike me, his face purple with fury, his entire body trembling with the effort to maintain control. But as his arm descended toward my face, something extraordinary happened. His expression suddenly changed from rage to confusion, his raised hand freezing in midair as his eyes widened with what looked like genuine surprise. A strange sound escaped his throat, not quite a gasp, not quite a groan, but something that seemed to come from deep within his chest. "What?" he began, but the word dissolved into a strangled, choking sound. His free hand flew to his chest, clutching at his shirt, as if trying to tear something out from inside his ribcage. The purple flush of anger drained from his face, replaced by a grayish pallor that made him look suddenly ancient, fragile, mortal, in a way that I had never seen before. He staggered backward, releasing me entirely as both hands went to his chest. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no sound emerged except for that strange, grinding wheeze that seemed to be forcing its way up from his lungs. I scrambled backward until my shoulders hit the kitchen wall, watching in fascination and terror, as the man who had terrorized me for years was suddenly reduced to a struggling, vulnerable creature fighting for each breath. His pale eyes, which had always seemed so cold and predatory, were now wide with panic and the dawning realization that something was terribly, irreversibly wrong. He took one stumbling step toward me, perhaps seeking help, perhaps intending to continue his assault despite his obvious distress. But his legs betrayed him buckling at the knees, and he collapsed onto the concrete floor with a sound like a sack of grain being dropped from a great height. The impact seemed to drive what little air remained from his lungs. He writhed on the cold floor, his back arching in what looked like agony, his fingers still clawing at his chest as if he could somehow reach inside and repair whatever had broken. His legs drummed against the concrete in spasmodic kicks that gradually grew weaker and less coordinated. And then, with a final rattling exhalation that seemed to go on forever, he was still. I remained pressed against the kitchen wall for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, staring at the motionless form of my tormentor and waiting for him to move to breathe, to rise up and continue the assault that had been so brutally interrupted. But there was no movement, no sound, except for the steady dripping of candle wax onto the wooden table and the distant whisper of wind through the mountain pines outside. Finally, with trembling hands and legs that felt like water, I crawled across the floor to where he lay. I placed my fingers against his neck, searching for the pulse that I had seen my mother check when my baby brother had been seriously ill the previous winter. There was nothing, no heartbeat, no warmth, no sign of the life that had just moments before been focused with such terrifying intensity on my destruction. Grandfather Jerome, the man who had made himself the center of my universe through fear and domination, was dead. I sat back on my heels, looking at his still form in the flickering candlelight, and tried to process what had just happened. A massive heart attack, I would later learn, when Dr. Matthews arrived to examine the body. A catastrophic failure of the organ that had been corrupted by years of hatred and cruelty, finally seizing at the moment when that corruption was about to manifest itself in its most destructive form. Was it coincidence? Was it the natural result of an unhealthy lifestyle and the stress of maintaining his facade of righteousness? Or was it, as I would eventually come to believe, something more, a divine intervention that arrived at the precise moment when all other hope had been exhausted? I looked up at the kitchen window, where I could see a slice of star-filled sky between the curtains my mother had sewn from flour sacks. The night was beautiful and peaceful, utterly indifferent to the human drama that had just concluded beneath its dark canopy. But in that moment, kneeling on the cold floor with my destroyed hair falling around my shoulders like a macabre crown, I felt something that I had almost forgotten existed. Peace. It was fragile and tentative, mixed with shock and confusion and the lingering terror of what had almost happened. But underneath all of that was a profound sense of relief, a lifting of a weight that I had carried for so long. I had forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. For the first time in years, there was no monster waiting in the shadows. There would be no more midnight rituals, no more forced confessions, no more hours of agony on the cold concrete floor. The eyes that had followed my every movement, measuring and judging and finding sin in every gesture, were closed forever. I was free. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the kitchen window, I heard the sound of footsteps on our front porch, my parents returning from their early morning departure to work. I had been sitting vigil over my grandfather's body for hours, but it felt like only minutes since the moment of his collapse. My mother's scream when she discovered the scene was a sound that seemed to tear through the morning air like lightning splitting a tree. She had entered the kitchen expecting to find breakfast preparations underway, not her daughter sitting beside the corpse of her father-in-law with her hair brutally shorn and her nightgown stained with blood from her damaged knees. "Betty! Oh, dear God, Betty!" She rushed to my side, her hands fluttering over my damaged appearance like birds trying to find a safe place to land. "What happened? What happened to your hair? What happened to him?" Before I could answer, my father appeared in the doorway, his work clothes still dusty from the fields, his face shifting from confusion to shock, to something that looked uncomfortably like accusation. What did you do?" he demanded, his voice harsh with grief and bewilderment. "What did you do to my father?" The question hit me like a physical blow, the immediate assumption that I was somehow responsible for the scene before us. But I had learned over the years of abuse that truth was often less important than the appearance of submission and repentance. "He had an attack," I said, simply, my voice hoarse from hours of screaming and crying. "His heart. It happened very suddenly." My father took a step toward me, his fists clenched, his face twisted with the complex emotions of a man who had just lost his father and was looking for someone to blame. For a terrifying moment, I thought he might continue where Grandfather Jerome had left off, that the cycle of violence would simply transfer from one generation to the next. But my mother stepped between us, her body forming a protective barrier as she took in the full extent of my condition, the brutally cut hair, the bleeding knees, the hollow expression in my eyes that spoke of trauma too deep for words. "Look at her, George," she said quietly, her voice carrying an authority I had never heard before. "Look at what that old man did to our daughter." For the first time in years, my father really looked at me not through the filter of respect for his father's authority, not with the blind trust he had placed in Grandfather Jerome's claims about my spiritual guidance, but with the clear vision of a parent who was finally seeing the evidence of systematic abuse. The anger in his expression slowly transformed into something else, horror perhaps, and a dawning understanding of the magnitude of his failure to protect his own child. He sank into one of our kitchen chairs, his face pale and his hands shaking as the implications of my appearance began to register fully. "What did he do to you?" He whispered the question, carrying the weight of years of willful blindness. And for the first time in my life, I told the truth about what had been happening in that house while my parents worked to keep our family fed and housed. I described the midnight rituals, the forced confessions, the hours of agony on the concrete floor. I explained about the invented sins, the systematic destruction of my self-worth, the growing terror I had felt as his behavior became increasingly predatory. My mother wept openly as I spoke, her hands covering her face, as if she could somehow shield herself from the knowledge of what she had failed to prevent. My father listened in silence, his face growing grayer with each revelation, his strong shoulders bowing under the weight of his guilt and grief. When I finished describing how Grandfather Jerome had collapsed at the very moment he was preparing to commit his final, most devastating crime, my father stood up slowly and walked to where the body lay on the floor. "God forgive me," he whispered, looking down at his father's still form. "God forgive me for letting this happen." The hours that followed passed in a strange, dreamlike sequence. Dr. Matthews arrived and confirmed what we already knew, that Grandfather Jerome had died of a massive heart attack, a catastrophic cardiac event that could have been triggered by any number of factors. The doctor examined me as well, documenting the obvious signs of abuse with the clinical detachment of a man who had seen too much human cruelty in his long career. "This child needs care," he told my parents before departing. "Medical care for her injuries, but also other kinds of care. What she's been through, no child should have to endure such treatment." The funeral was held 3 days later, a small, subdued ceremony attended by family and a few neighbors who had known Grandfather Jerome as a respected member of the community. The local pastor, who had often praised his devout faith and moral authority, delivered a eulogy that spoke of his dedication to God and his family, his commitment to righteous living and spiritual guidance. I sat in the back row wearing a headscarf to cover my butchered hair and listened to these tributes to a man who had spent years systematically destroying a child's soul in the name of religious purity. The disconnect between the public image and the private reality was so profound that I felt as if I were attending the funeral of a stranger. Only one person seemed to understand the truth behind the carefully maintained facade. Mrs. Celestine, the elderly midwife who had delivered most of the children in our community, approached me after the service with eyes that held wisdom accumulated over decades of observing human nature. "Death sometimes brings freedom, doesn't it, child?" She whispered, her weathered hand briefly touching my shoulder. "Don't feel guilty for the relief you're experiencing. Some people bring only darkness into the world, even when they carry a Bible." Her words were like a key unlocking a door I hadn't even realized was closed. Someone else had seen through Grandfather Jerome's mask of righteousness. Someone else understood that his death was not a tragedy, but a liberation. I wasn't alone in my knowledge of what he had really been. "I should have done something," she continued, her voice heavy with regret. "I saw how he looked at you. I saw how you withered whenever he was around. I should have spoken up, should have found a way to help. Forgive me for my cowardice." That simple acknowledgement, that validation of my experience from an adult who had no reason to lie or manipulate, was perhaps the beginning of my long journey back to emotional health. For years, I had been told that my perceptions were wrong, that my suffering was deserved, that my abuser was actually my spiritual savior. To hear someone else confirm that what I had experienced was real and wrong and completely undeserved was like being given permission to trust my own memory and judgment again. In the weeks following the funeral, our household underwent a complete transformation. My mother conducted what she called a cleansing, removing every trace of Grandfather Jerome's presence from our home. His clothes were donated to charity, his few personal possessions were sold or given away, and his black Bible, that weapon he had wielded so effectively against my psyche, was the last item to be consumed by the fire she built in our backyard. "This isn't the Word of God," she said, as the flames ate through the worn pages that had been used to justify so much cruelty. "It's been corrupted, turned into something evil. The real God, the God of love and mercy, wouldn't recognize what this book was used for." My father struggled more with the aftermath, carrying a burden of guilt that seemed to age him visibly with each passing day. He would sit for hours staring at nothing, his calloused hands clenched in his lap, his face reflecting the internal torment of a man who had failed in his most fundamental duty as a parent. One evening, nearly a month after the funeral, he came to my bedside and attempted what I think was meant to be an apology, though the words came out broken and inadequate. "Betty?" He began, his voice rough with emotion. I will never forgive myself for what I allowed to happen to you. I was so busy trying to keep food on the table, so grateful for his help with the household, that I never questioned. I never looked closely enough to see." "It wasn't your fault, Papa," I said, though part of me wasn't entirely sure I believed it. "He fooled everyone. He was very good at hiding what he really was." "It was my duty to protect you," he insisted, his voice breaking. "And I failed. I failed completely." That night, I told him everything, every detail of the abuse I had endured, every midnight ritual, every forced confession, every moment of terror and humiliation. And for the first time since I was a small child, my father wept openly, his strong body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul. When I finished, he did something he hadn't done in years. He embraced me, an awkward, hesitant hug from a man who wasn't sure he had the right to offer comfort after failing so catastrophically in his protective role. "We're going to heal," he promised, his voice firm despite his tears. All of us. We're going to heal from this, and I swear to you on my life that no one will ever hurt you like this again. The healing process was neither quick nor simple. There were days when I would wake screaming from nightmares that replayed the worst moments of my abuse with vivid, terrifying clarity. There were times when the sight of any elderly man would send me into panic attacks that left me gasping and shaking for hours. There were Sundays when I couldn't enter the church because the smell of candles and incense would transport me instantly back to those midnight kitchen rituals. But there were also good days, days when I caught myself laughing at something my mother said, days when I helped prepare meals without feeling afraid, days when I looked at the sky and felt something other than despair. The healing was incremental, measured in small victories and gradual returns to normal emotional responses. When I turned 17, my parents made a decision that would have been unthinkable. Before Grandfather Jerome's death, they sent me back to school. Not to the one-room schoolhouse where I had learned my letters, but to the larger school in the county seat where I could receive the kind of education that might prepare me for a future beyond domestic servitude. "You're going to be somebody," my father declared with a determination that surprised me. "You're going to be independent, able to take care of yourself. You'll never have to depend on any man for your survival." It was a radical philosophy for a rural family in the 1950s, but trauma had changed my parents' perspective on many things. They had seen what could happen when a girl was powerless and isolated, and they were determined to ensure that I would never be so vulnerable again. School was both challenging and healing. After years of isolation being around other young people, my own age felt strange and wonderful. I discovered that I had a natural aptitude for learning that had been suppressed but not destroyed by my years of abuse. I excelled in literature and history, finding in books the wider world that had been denied to me for so long. It was at school that I met John Patterson, the 19-year-old son of a local merchant, who was studying to become a pharmacist. He was different from any young man I had ever encountered, gentle, respectful, never presumptuous or demanding. He courted me with a patience that confused me at first, having learned to expect that masculine attention always came with dangerous strings attached. Our first conversation took place on the steps of the school library where I was reading during my lunch break. He approached with obvious nervousness, clutching his own books as if they were a shield against rejection. "Excuse me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I hope you don't mind my asking, but what are you reading? You always seem so absorbed in your books." I showed him the cover, a collection of poetry by Emily Dickinson that I had discovered in the school's small library. The poems spoke to me with their themes of isolation and inner strength, their exploration of faith and doubt, their celebration of the power of the individual spirit to survive and even flourish despite circumstances that seemed designed to crush it. "She writes about difficult things," I said carefully, unsure how much of my own experience I was willing to reveal to this virtual stranger. "But she finds beauty in them too. Hope even when everything seems hopeless." John nodded thoughtfully, his eyes reflecting an understanding that went deeper than his years would suggest. "Sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the darkest places," he said. "Like flowers that only bloom at night, or stars that shine brightest against the blackest sky." It was the beginning of a courtship that lasted almost 2 years, a slow, careful dance of two young people learning to trust each other with their hearts and their histories. John never pressured me for information about my past, never pushed for physical intimacy beyond what I was comfortable offering, never made me feel judged or inadequate because of my obvious emotional scars. Our first kiss didn't happen until we had been seeing each other for more than a year. We were sitting by the river that wound through our valley, watching the sun set behind the mountains, and talking about our dreams for the future. He had been accepted to pharmacy school in Richmond and was trying to find the courage to ask if I would wait for him during his 2 years of training. "Betty," he said, his voice trembling with nervousness, "there's something I need to ask you." I tensed, expecting some demand or ultimatum that would force me to choose between my healing and his desires. But instead, he simply looked into my eyes with a vulnerability that matched my own. "May I kiss you?" he asked. "I mean, only if you want me to. Only if it wouldn't make you uncomfortable." The simple fact that he asked that he requested permission rather than simply taking what he wanted moved me more than any declaration of love could have. For the first time in my life, a man was treating my consent as something valuable, something worth obtaining rather than simply overriding. I nodded, unable to speak around the emotion that had suddenly closed my throat. When his lips touched mine, soft and tentative and completely respectful, I didn't feel fear. Instead, I felt something I had almost forgotten. Existed the possibility of physical affection that was gentle rather than violent, given rather than taken, shared rather than imposed. We were married in the summer of 1962 in a small ceremony at the church where I had finally been able to return after years of absence. I was 22, he was 24, and we were both old enough to understand that we were not just joining our lives together, but also promising to help each other heal from whatever wounds the past had inflicted. Our wedding night was tender and patient with John, showing the same consideration he had demonstrated throughout our courtship. He understood, without needing detailed explanations, that my relationship with physical intimacy was complicated by trauma. He was willing to proceed at whatever pace felt safe to me, to stop whenever I needed to stop, to hold me when the memories threatened to overwhelm the present moment. "We have our whole lives," he whispered when I apologized for my fears and limitations. "There's no hurry. We'll figure it out together one day at a time." Our first child, a daughter we named Celeste, in honor of Mrs. Celestine, was born in 1964. When I held that tiny perfect being in my arms for the first time, I made a silent vow that would guide every decision I made as a mother. No one will ever hurt you the way I was hurt. No one will ever use religion or authority or family position to make you feel ashamed of who you are. You will grow up knowing that your body belongs to you, that your thoughts and feelings matter, that you have the right to say no to anyone who tries to harm you. Motherhood brought its own healing, but it also brought new challenges. Caring for a helpless infant sometimes triggered memories of my own helplessness during the worst years of abuse. There were nights when Celeste's crying would somehow blend with the echoes of my own childhood tears, creating a cacophony of grief that threatened to overwhelm my carefully constructed emotional stability. It was during one of these episodes when Celeste was about 2 years old that I had my first major breakdown since grandfather Jerome's death. I was hanging laundry on the line in our backyard, watching my daughter play with her rag doll, when a wave of memory struck me with such force that my knees buckled and I collapsed onto the grass. The flashback was complete and overwhelming. I was 16 again, kneeling on the cold concrete, while grandfather Jerome cut away my hair and prepared to assault me. I could feel his hands on my nightgown, smell his stale breath, hear his voice condemning me for sins I had never committed. The terror was so complete that for several minutes I couldn't distinguish between past and present, couldn't remember that I was safe, that he was dead, that the nightmare had ended years ago. "Mama!" Celeste's worried voice finally penetrated the fog of memory. "Mama's sad." I looked up to see my daughter standing over me, her small face creased with concern, her toy forgotten on the ground. The sight of her so innocent, so trusting, so completely dependent on me for protection, snapped me back to the present and reminded me of the promises I had made. "Mama's okay, sweetheart," I managed to say, though my voice was shaking and my hands were still trembling with residual fear. Sometimes grown-ups get sad about things that happened a long time ago. But I'm okay now. That night, after Celeste was asleep, I told John the complete story of my abuse for the first time. I had shared pieces of it before enough for him to understand why certain things frightened me, or why I sometimes had nightmares. But I had never recounted the full scope of grandfather Jerome's cruelty, never described in detail the systematic campaign of psychological destruction that had shaped my formative years. John listened without interruption, his face growing graver with each revelation. When I reached the part about that final night, about Grandfather Jerome's intentions and his sudden fatal heart attack, John took my hands in his and held them tightly. "Do you think it was wrong to feel relief?" I asked, voicing the question that had haunted me for years. When I realized he was dead, when I knew he could never hurt me again, I felt such joy that it frightened me. What kind of person celebrates another person's death? John was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. Finally, he spoke with the measured thoughtfulness that had first attracted me to him. "I think," he said, "that God understands the hearts of the desperate better than we understand ourselves. You didn't cause his death, you weren't responsible for what happened to him. But you had every right to be grateful for your freedom. Who wouldn't feel relief after years of torture? Who wouldn't be thankful to finally be safe?" His words helped, but the guilt remained. It was several months later when I finally worked up the courage to speak with Pastor Williams, the young minister who had recently arrived at our church, that I began to find a framework for understanding what had happened that night. Pastor Williams was different from the older, more traditional clergy I had known. He had studied psychology as well as theology, and he understood trauma in ways that previous generations of religious leaders had not. When I haltingly described my grandfather's abuse and my conflicted feelings about his death, he listened with the same patience that John had shown, but with additional insights born of professional training. "Betty," he said after I had finished my story, "have you ever read the story of David and Goliath? Not just the simple version we tell children, but the complete account in Samuel." I nodded, wondering where he was leading. "David didn't just defeat Goliath," Pastor Williams continued. "He celebrated the giant's death. He gave thanks to God for it because that death meant liberation for his people. The Bible is full of stories where divine intervention results in the death of oppressors. Pharaoh's army swallowed by the Red Sea, the corrupt priests of Baal consumed by fire, countless examples of God acting to protect the innocent by removing those who would harm them." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "What happened that night in your kitchen? I don't believe it was coincidence. I think God saw what was about to happen to one of his most vulnerable children, and he intervened in the only way that would ensure your complete safety. Your grandfather's death wasn't a tragedy, it was a miracle. A harsh miracle, perhaps, but still an act of divine mercy." This perspective didn't immediately resolve my guilt, but it gave me a new way to think about the events that had shaped my life. Over the following months, as I continued to meet with Pastor Williams and gradually began to rebuild my relationship with faith, I started to see my survival not as something to feel guilty about, but as evidence of a protective love that had never abandoned me, even in my darkest hours. The healing continued in small increments over the years that followed. John and I had a second child, a son we named Gabriel, and with each milestone of their development, I was forced to confront new aspects of my own wounded past. Watching them play freely, seeing their unguarded trust in the adults around them, observing their natural joy in simple pleasures, all of these experiences highlighted how much had been stolen from my own childhood. But there was also profound healing in being able to provide for my children what had been denied to me. I made sure they knew they were loved unconditionally, that their bodies belonged to them, that no adult had the right to touch them inappropriately or force them to keep dangerous secrets. I taught them that religion should bring comfort and hope, not fear and shame, and that any person who used God's name to justify cruelty was not speaking for the divine. When Celeste was 10 years old, she asked me about the scars on my knees, faint lines that had never completely faded despite decades of healing. I realized it was time to share an age-appropriate version of my story to help her understand why I was sometimes sad for no apparent reason, why certain things frightened me, why I was so protective of her and her brother. A long time ago, I told her, when I was a little girl, someone hurt me. Someone who was supposed to take care of me instead made me very sad and very scared. But I survived, and I learned that even when terrible things happen, there's always hope for healing and happiness. She listened with the serious attention that children bring to adult confidences, her young face reflecting both compassion and confusion. "Did the person who hurt you get punished?" she asked. "Yes," I said simply. "He did, and he can never hurt anyone again." "Good," she declared with the fierce certainty of childhood. "People who hurt children should be punished." As my children grew older and my own healing progressed, I began to feel a calling to help other survivors of abuse. I started by volunteering at a women's shelter that had opened in the county seat, offering support to women and children who were fleeing dangerous situations. My own experience, as painful as it had been, gave me credibility with people who had learned to distrust authority figures and professional helpers. I discovered that really listening without judgment or attempts to minimize their pain, was often the most powerful gift I could offer. So many survivors had been told that their abuse wasn't that bad, that they should forgive and forget that dwelling on the past was unhealthy. Simply having someone acknowledge that what they had experienced was real and wrong and completely undeserved was sometimes the first step toward healing. In 1985, when I was 45 years old, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable. During my traumatized youth, I returned to school. I enrolled in night classes at the community college, working toward a degree in social work that would allow me to help other survivors more effectively. It took me 6 years studying part-time while raising my family and maintaining our household, but I finally graduated with honors at the age of 51. My children were proud of my achievement, but more importantly, they saw their mother as someone who refused to be defined by her wounds, who could transform pain into purpose and use her own healing journey to light the way for others. Celeste, inspired by my example, went on to become a lawyer specializing in cases involving domestic violence and child abuse. Gabriel became a therapist focusing on trauma recovery and family healing. Both of them understood in ways that were both heartbreaking and hopeful that their family history included darkness as well as light, that their mother's strength had been forged in fires that no child should have to endure. But they also saw that survival was possible, that healing was achievable, that love could triumph over fear given enough time and support. In 1995, I published a book about my experiences, a memoir that explored the intersection of faith and trauma, the process of healing from religious abuse, and the possibility of reclaiming spirituality after it had been weaponized against you. The book found an audience among survivors and the professionals who worked with them, generating hundreds of letters from people who had experienced similar abuse and found hope in my story of survival and recovery. One letter from a woman named Sarah in Texas particularly moved me. When I was 15, my stepfather began using Bible verses to justify inappropriate behavior toward me. He convinced me that I was troubled by dark spirits and that only his prayers and treatments could save my soul. I believed this for 3 years, until I finally found the courage to tell a teacher what was happening. Reading your book helped me understand that what he did wasn't religion. It was abuse disguised as faith. Thank you for having the courage to share your story. It helped me feel less alone and less confused. Letters like Sarah's reminded me why it was important to speak openly about experiences that many people would prefer to forget or minimize. Child abuse thrives in silence and secrecy, protected by shame and misplaced loyalty. Only by bringing these stories into the light, by refusing to let perpetrators hide behind religious authority or family traditions, could we hope to protect future generations from similar harm. As I entered my 70s, I found myself looking back on my life with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude that would have seemed impossible during my years of abuse. The sorrow was for the childhood that had been stolen from me, for the innocence that had been destroyed, for the years of fear and self-doubt that had followed. But the gratitude was for the healing that had been possible, for the love that had entered my life, for the opportunity to transform my wounds into wisdom that could help others. On my 80th birthday, my children and grandchildren gathered for a celebration that included a return visit to the valley where I had grown up. The old house where I had been abused was gone, replaced by a modern home occupied by a young family with small children. The fields where my father had worked were still productive, though now farmed with modern equipment, rather than the manual labor that had defined his generation. Standing in that valley surrounded by the mountains that had witnessed both my trauma and my triumph, I felt a profound sense of completion. The frightened, broken girl who had knelt on a cold concrete floor, convinced that she was irredeemably evil, had become a woman who understood her own worth, who had built a life of love and purpose despite the cruel beginnings. I visited the small cemetery where Grandfather Jerome was buried, his grave marked by a simple stone that bore only his name and dates. I felt no hatred as I stood there, no desire for posthumous revenge or vindication. What I felt instead was pity for a man who had chosen darkness over light, cruelty over compassion, fear over love. Whatever demons had driven him to abuse a child, they had ultimately destroyed him as surely as they had tried to destroy me. But I had survived. Not just survived, but flourished. I had loved and been loved, had raised children who were whole and healthy, had helped other survivors find their way back to the light. My life had meaning and purpose that went far beyond the trauma that had shaped its early years. Now at 83, sitting in my comfortable home with the Blue Ridge Mountains visible through my window, I am finally ready to tell this story in its entirety. Not because I need to purge the memories or seek sympathy for old wounds, but because I know that somewhere someone is enduring what I endured. Someone is being told that their suffering is deserved, that their abuser is acting with divine authority, that speaking out would be wrong or futile or dangerous. To that person, I want to say, you are not alone. What is happening to you is not your fault. The God that your abuser claims to represent would never condone such treatment of his children. Your pain is real, your fear is valid, and your survival matters more than any authority figure's reputation or any family's secrets. There is life after abuse. There is healing after trauma. There is hope after even the darkest night. I found my path back to the light, and so can you. The hand that strikes a child is not the hand of God, no matter what verses are quoted to justify the violence. The voice that condemns an innocent soul is not the voice of the divine, regardless of how much religious authority it claims. The heart that finds pleasure in a child's suffering is not a heart that serves any God worth serving. But there is another voice, another presence, another kind of power that stands ready to intervene when all other hope has failed. Sometimes that intervention comes through the courage of someone willing to speak up, sometimes through the wisdom of professionals trained to recognize abuse, sometimes through the love of family members who choose to believe and protect rather than deny and enable. And sometimes, in the rarest and most desperate circumstances, it comes through what can only be called divine intervention, a sudden catastrophic failure of the abuser's heart at the exact moment when innocence hangs in the balance, a miracle that is harsh in its execution but perfect in its timing, a reminder that there are forces greater than human evil working to protect the vulnerable. I don't know why some children are rescued and others are not, why some prayers for deliverance are answered dramatically and others seem to go unheard. The mystery of suffering and salvation is too complex for any simple explanation. But I know that every child who survives such ordeals carries within them a spark of something unbreakable, something that no amount of cruelty can completely extinguish. That spark is hope. It is resilience. It is the image of God that no human evil can destroy. If you are reading this story and seeing reflections of your own experience in my words, know that your spark still burns. It may be hidden beneath layers of shame and fear, buried under years of being told you are worthless or evil or deserving of punishment. But it is there waiting for the right moment, the right support, the right opportunity to blaze forth and reclaim your life. You are not what was done to you. You are not the lies you were told about yourself. You are not the shame that was placed on your shoulders by someone else's sins. You are a child of the universe worthy of love and protection and respect. You are a survivor stronger than you know and more valuable than you have been taught to believe. You are hope, incarnate living proof that darkness cannot extinguish light, that cruelty cannot destroy love, that evil cannot triumph over the human spirit. Your story is not over. Your healing is possible. Your freedom waits on the other side of the courage to speak, to seek help, to believe that you deserve better than you have received. I found my way back to the light after years in the darkness. The path was long and difficult, marked by setbacks and struggles, small victories and moments of doubt. But it led ultimately to a life filled with love and purpose and joy that seemed impossible during my darkest hours. That same path exists for you. Those same possibilities await you. That same hope that carried me through can carry you through as well. You are not alone. You are not forgotten. You are not beyond help or healing or hope. The mountains that watched over my childhood trauma also witnessed my triumph. The same valleys that echoed with my childhood tears now ring with the laughter of my grandchildren. The same hands that were once raised in desperate prayer for deliverance now reach out to help other survivors find their way home. This is the promise I offer to anyone who needs to hear it. There is life after abuse, love after trauma, hope after despair. The journey is not easy, and the healing is not quick, but both are possible for anyone with the courage to begin. Take the first step. Speak the first word. Make the first call. Your freedom is waiting, and you are worth fighting for.